talk about several capabilities that are beyond the tools themselves, but also become part of the tools when used right. The first is creating effective problem statements. Now, I've argued that this is perhaps the most important skill, the most important capability, and something that I wish I could extract from good problem solving and teach all over the world. Now, one of the reasons this is so important is how often we generate misalignment by not having good problem statements, how often we generate waste. We take this skill for granted, yet go into any meeting, 5 people, 10 people, you're talking about a problem, and ask those 5 to 10 people, what is the problem? I can almost guarantee you're not going to end with the same one answer from all of those 5 or 10 people. You're probably going to end up with 10 different answers. So that suggests it's not so easy if we can't even get 5 to 10 people to agree on what the problem is. It's a difficult thing to do. And it really frames all the rest of the work we're about to do. Now, this skill doesn't just help with problem solving itself, it helps with many of what I would call the close cousins of problem solving. Things like creating goals and objectives, which is largely about closing gaps and solving problems. How we design metrics, how we lead innovation or do product development. Selling something is a form of problem solving, and developing a strategy is another form of problem solving. All of these close coupled cousins of problem solving all benefit from better capability of developing problem statements. Now, what is a problem statement? Well, the best description is that it's a gap. We define a problem statement as a gap. Ideally, a gap between a current condition, where we are, and an expected condition, where we want to be, where we should be, where we ought to be. Now, sometimes we don't know what those answers are. We don't know where we should be, we don't know where we are, and so we just say things like it's broken or it should be faster. And I would argue that it's so important to frame problem statements as a gap that you're better off saying, we are currently at X and we should be at Y. Right? You just put in a blank, put in X, put in Y, whatever you have to do to be able to say the sentence as a gap. We may decide that some of the work we have to do is figure out what X and Y are, but we don't know it yet. In the meantime, let's make sure that we still define the problem statement as a gap. Now, why is it a gap? Well, because problem statements are like a vector. Now, for those that remember their math, a vector has both magnitude and direction. Both of these are important in problem solving. The direction determines where we want to go, and if we're just 5 degrees off center in defining the direction, we end up in a very different place. It's also about the magnitude. How far do we have to go? If I tell you to lose 5 pounds, or if I tell you to lose 75 pounds, those are 2 very different magnitudes. And even frame how you think about what's at risk, what the challenges are, what the potential solutions are. And so having a problem statement as a vector with magnitude and direction really helps frame the work that has yet to be done. Just think about a pizza shop. If you told a pizza shop that they have to make pizzas faster, well, what does that mean? I have no idea. Well, direction, solving a Friday night typical order of a large pizza with 1 topping is very different than the direction of solving a Super Bowl Sunday where we have a large surge of orders, of very large orders all at the same time. But also understanding the magnitude. Is it about taking 5 minutes off the typical order time or taking 30 minutes off the typical order time? Again, those things dramatically reframe what the work is and what the potential solutions are. How do we know we've closed the gap unless that gap has both magnitude and direction? Now, I've said this before in other videos, but it's also important to understand the relationship between our problem statement and standards. So the first 3 questions that we should almost always ask are, do we have a standard? If not, well, that probably is the gap that we have to close. If we do have a standard, did we follow the standard? And if not, why not? Right? that might be the gap that we have to close. If we have a standard and we aren't following it, why not? There's typically a valid reason. I don't want to say a good reason, but a valid reason why we aren't following the standard. Anything from we didn't know it existed all the way through we didn't have what we needed. Well, let's close that gap. Now we have a clearly defined gap. And third, what's wrong with this standard? How might we change the standard to get the performance or the outcome that we want? Now, along with creating problem statements is some people consider this a separate skill, some it's part of problem statements, but breaking down problems, getting them to the most granular level that we can. The important thing when we start thinking about problem statements is not to over-aggregate problem statements. As I record this, much of the world is struggling with staffing issues. Well, right on the surface, staffing issues are I don't have enough people to do what we need to do. But the hiring problem is different than the retention problem. The hours management problem is different than the engagement problem. We have to understand these are all different problems. They all might relate to the same outcome, but they are different gaps. And it's much easier and way more effective to solve gaps as they specifically exist. And so that's part of breaking down the problem, whether we start to aggregate and we break the problem down, or we begin at a granular level. We see an instance, an issue, a specific gap that we can go close. We want to make sure the problem statements exist at a granular level. Now, some of the major failure modes, in addition to aggregating our problem statements, is that we put solutions into the problem statements. Well, we need automation. We don't have automation. Well, that leaves us only one solution. That's not really a problem statement. That's really the articulation of what we want. Now, there might be a reason why we want that, but that's the gap that we're trying to close. We also have to be careful about not putting assumed causes, or at least making too big a jump around assumed causes. If we can make an immediate leap and understand what's there, then we can start to understand why that exists. But when we leap too far, we miss the point. For example, you might say your window's leaking. And we've assumed that the window is the cause of that problem. But if we don't really know that for sure, if we can't actually see the leak coming through the water, the real gap is that there's water where there shouldn't be. It could be that it's the window, it could be that it's the frame, it could be that it's the roof, and it just happens to collect at the window. If we assume too much too quickly, we limit our ability to be curious about cause and effect. Now, the last sort of failure mode is failing to socialize our problem statement, gaining alignment with others, gaining agreement that this is the gap that we indeed need to close. If we don't have that alignment, that agreement around the gap, when we get to solutions, we're going to have a very hard time getting agreement then. So whether it's our internal customers or collaborators or people that have to be part of the solution, we need to make sure that we get alignment or agreement about the gap early in the process, not at the very end. One of the fathers of problem solving, the scientific thinker John Dewey, stated as part of his philosophy that a problem well defined is a problem half solved. I think this frames up the importance of problem statements really well. That if there was any skill that we invested more time than we typically do, this is the place to invest that time. Get the problem statement right, and you have solved the problem that you have to go make your endeavors to go forward with.